Government orders.
Bills Commons. Number 77, second reading in reference to a legislative committee of Bill C-77, an act to authorize the taking of special temporary measures to ensure safety and security during national emergencies and to amend other acts in consequence thereof.
Mr. Beatty, seconded by Mr. Lewis, moves that Bill C-77, an act to authorize the taking of special temporary measures to ensure safety and security during national emergencies and to amend other acts in consequence thereof, be now read a second time and referred to a legislative committee. The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, for each of us, there's a handful of public events that takes place in our lifetime, which leaves an impression on us for the rest of our lives. The end of the Second World War, the death of President Kennedy, or the first footsteps of the first man on the moon are all examples of that. However, for Canadians, in October of 1970, there was another event which took place that I think all of us who were alive during that period will never forget. That happened as, in response to a crisis in the province of Quebec, the government invoked the War Measures Act in time of peace and suspended the civil liberties of Canadians from one coast of this country to another. I was a student at that time at the University of Western Ontario, but I remember still very well the address that was given in a national broadcast by Prime Minister Trudeau, who commenced his remarks by saying, "I am speaking to you at a moment of grave crisis when violent and fanatical men are attempting to destroy the unity and the freedom of Canada." Mr. Trudeau then continued by explaining the government's decision to invoke the War Measures Act, to outline some of the circumstances which led to the government taking such an action. And he explained as well that he was taking such measures which he recognized were exceptionally extreme and would have a profound effect upon civil liberties across the country, because it was essential that he do so. In Mr. Trudeau's words, the War Measures Act gives sweeping powers to the government. It also suspends the operation of the Canadian Bill of Rights. I can assure you that the government is most reluctant to seek these powers, and did so only when it became crystal clear that the situation could not be controlled unless some extraordinary assistance was made available on an urgent basis. Further, Mr. Trudeau continued, "These are strong powers, and I find them as distasteful as I'm sure you do. They are necessary, however, to permit the police to deal with persons who advocate or promote the violent overthrow of our democratic system. In short, I assure you that the government recognizes its grave responsibilities in interfering in certain cases with civil liberties, and that it remains answerable to the people of Canada for its actions." Speaker, the Prime Minister of the day, Mr. Trudeau, concluded in this way, "It is my firm intention to discuss then with the leaders of the opposition parties the desirability of introducing legislation of a less comprehensive nature. In this respect, I earnestly solicit from the leaders and from all honourable members constructive suggestions for the amendment of the regulations. Such suggestions will be given careful consideration for possible inclusion in any new statute." Mr. Speaker, the Justice Minister of the day is the Right Honourable Leader of the Opposition today, and he will of course remember very well the circumstances which led to the decision to invoke the War Measures Act for the first and only time in a period of peace in Canada. He'll remember, as well as will many members of this House, the commitments that have been made by all three political parties to see legislation brought in a period of calm which would better protect the civil liberties of Canadians, while at the same time ensuring that the government had the powers that were necessary to protect the needs and the safety of Canadians in the case of grave crises. What we're doing today is to act on that commitment that was made some 17 years ago. The time surely has come now where we in this House must keep faith with the people of Canada. Mr. Speaker, on June 26th, I tabled in the House two bills, C-76 and C-77, and announced that the federal government was repealing the War Measures Act, withdrawing the Emergency Planning Order of 1981, and introducing new federal emergencies legislation to replace them. The bill which I'm presenting today complements Bill C-76, the Emergency Preparedness Act, which was given second reading on November 2nd and referred to a legislative committee. Although the bills are in a sense complementary, they're being considered separately. Bill C-77, the Emergencies Act, will replace the old War Measures Act. It includes safeguarded and appropriately limited powers to deal with 4 types of national emergencies. It ensures that the exceptional powers granted by Parliament will be no more than are needed for the specific emergency at hand. It will ensure a graduated response and not an overwhelming one. In addition, the Emergencies Act will provide for compensation in the event of personal loss, injury, or damage. Mr. Speaker, the bill's preamble defines a national emergency as an urgent and critical situation of a temporary nature that imperils the well-being of Canada as a whole, or that is of such proportions or nature as to exceed the capacity or authority of a province to deal with it, and thus can be effectively dealt with only by Parliament in the exercise of the powers conferred on it by the Constitution. With passage of the Emergencies Act, the government will be able to act quickly during national emergencies to limit suffering through the use of means that, while extraordinary, will be limited to what is strictly required. The Emergencies Act will clearly constitute a vast improvement over the legislation which it replaces. It will provide a unified and coherent set of measures to respond to emergencies while incorporating maximum safeguards of fundamental rights and freedoms. The Act will provide for parliamentary review of the use of emergency powers. It will require the Executive to answer to Parliament for the use of its powers. The period during which the Act may apply will be limited, and the nature of the emergency measures will be restricted to what is appropriate in the circumstances. In addition, the government will have to return to Parliament for any continuation, amendment, renewal, or declaration of emergency. Under the Act, the provinces are to be consulted before the federal government can declare a federal emergency. In the event of a peacetime public welfare or public order emergency primarily affecting a single province, the province experiencing the direct effects of the emergency will have a veto over the Act's invocation. Under Parts 3 and 4, which cover areas of federal jurisdiction, there will still be consultation to the extent that is appropriate and practical to do so. The Act was designed so that each part may be invoked separately. In extreme situations, however, 2 or more parts of the Act may be invoked simultaneously. Part 4 of the Act is concerned with a war emergency. This part grants to the Executive powers similar to those of the War Measures Act. However, they can be invoked only in time of war or of other real or imminent armed conflict, and are subject to similar safeguards as in other parts of the Act. There's no reference to insurrection or apprehended insurrection in Part 4. Certains critiques ont tenté d'amalgamer la loi ancienne et la loi nouvelle. Ils auraient voulu faire croire que le partie 4 de la loi sur les mesures d'urgence est pratiquement identique à la loi sur les mesures de guerre. Ils ont aussi affirmé que depuis que la Charte s'applique à la loi sur les mesures de guerre, il n'y a vraiment aucune différence entre les deux textes législatifs. Ils prétendent même que la tentation d'avoir recours à l'utilisation de la loi sur les mesures d'urgence sera plus grande puisque, selon eux, cette loi donne l'illusion d'offrir plus de garanties que la loi sur les mesures de guerre et qu'il sera plus facile de l'invoquer. Ces affirmations sont dénuées de tout fondement. Le partie 4 de la loi sur les mesures d'urgence concernera l'état de guerre ou autres conflits armés effectifs ou imminents. La loi sur les mesures de guerre s'applique à l'état de guerre, d'invasion ou d'insurrection réelle ou appréhendée. Dans le nouveau projet de loi, l'invocation de la loi devra pouvoir être justifiée et pourra être contestée. Dans la loi actuelle, la déclaration de l'état d'urgence relève d'une preuve concluant que l'état de guerre, d'invasion ou d'insurrection réelle ou appréhendée existe. Dans la proposition du gouvernement, les décrets et les règlements seront sujets à l'examen du Parlement et le Parlement pourra prendre l'initiative de reconsidérer et d'abroger une déclaration d'état de guerre. Présentement, il n'existe aucune disposition à ce sujet. La loi sur les mesures d'urgence sera assujettie à la Charte canadienne des droits et libertés. La loi sur les mesures de guerre ne l'est pas. La nouvelle loi prévoira un effet limité à 360 jours. La législation actuelle n'a aucune limitation de temps quant à son application. des dispositions concernant l'indemnisation des victimes de dommages ou de blessures à la suite de l'application de la loi sur les mesures d'urgence seront contenues dans cette loi. La loi actuelle n'en prévoit pas. Enfin, avant l'application de la nouvelle loi, les provinces seront consultées et leur point de vue devra être reporté au Parlement, ce qui constitue aussi une invocation. Une innovation. Lorsque le gouvernement invoqua la loi sur les mesures de guerre en octobre 1970, il le fit avec réticence, tout en estimant qu'il n'avait pas d'autre choix. Cette situation conduisit le Premier ministre Trudeau à déclarer à la Chambre le 16 octobre 1970 le manque de temps pour prendre d'autres mesures et l'absence de quelques autres autorités législatives nous a forcés à la loi sur les mesures de guerre. Mr. Speaker, the War Measures Act is too broad and it's too sweeping. It makes no provision either for dealing moderately with peacetime disasters, nor for a measured and prudent response to international tension. For 17 years, Canadians and politicians of all parties have been advocating abolition of the War Measures Act, saying that it was outmoded and dangerous and too blunt an instrument for anything short of war. The present Right Honourable Leader of the Opposition, as Minister of Justice during the October crisis, stated in the House on November 4th, 1970, quote, "The government recognized and from the beginning expressed the opinion that the War Measures Act was too blunt an instrument. We recognize the need for a more definite but flexible statutory instrument." Similarly, on April 28th of this year, the member for Thunder Bay Nipigon moved that the government should consider the advisability of repealing the War Measures Act, which, to quote him, authorizes unlimited and arbitrary exercise of power by the Government of Canada during periods of war or apprehended insurrection, without providing any review mechanism for such actions, nor any basis for redress of the victims of unjust actions. Mr. Speaker, he went on to say that he thought there were many Canadians who would support Parliament expressing itself in this particular long-standing piece of legislation. He said that he thought that the Draconian War Measures Act should be removed from the books, that what we needed were review mechanisms to ensure protection of individual rights and freedoms. Le même jour, en réponse aux motions du nouveau Parti démocratique visant à abolir la loi sur les mesures de guerre, le député de Saint-Denis, en rappelant la dernière fois où cette législation fut invoquée, s'écriait « Je regrette simplement une chose, c'est que plus de temps ne soit pas mis à notre disposition pour reparler de cette page de l'histoire du Canada, qui n'est certainement pas l'une des plus belles pages d'histoire, c'est certain, dans la question des droits humains au Québec ou au Canada. » Et ce député de poursuivre, à l'époque, plusieurs d'entre nous, jeunes parlementaires, deviennent presque agonisés. Le nouveau Parti démocratique a tenu à l'époque un débat pénible pour décider de la position adoptée. Je reconnais que bon nombre de néo-démocrates ont voté contre la loi, mais après débat. Je me le rappelle fort bien. J'ai accepté d'appuyer la loi sur les mesures de guerre à condition de pouvoir participer au débat. Je dirai en français et en anglais que je regretterai toujours d'avoir voté pour la loi sur les mesures de guerre. J'ai estimé que c'était mon devoir de Canadien de le faire compte tenu des renseignements dont nous disposions. Je n'avais pas le choix, avoué avec une franchise qui l'honore, the deputy de Saint-Denis. Mr. Speaker, one effort to examine the problem of legislation to deal with emergencies came from the Task Force on Canadian Unity. It recommended that the government have the right to seek parliamentary approval within a specified time limit for any extraordinary powers. It also recommended that the government state the reasons for its action and the duration of the emergency powers in its proclamation. The task force further recommended that provincial powers and individual rights be safeguarded to various degrees, depending on whether the nation was at war or at peace. I've read the recommendations of the Pépin-Robarts task force carefully, and I can assure members of this House that Bill C-77 adequately meets them. The legislation whose second reading I'm proposing today will provide the necessary flexibility to respond to national crises without invoking the War Measures Act. It applies only to national emergencies, and it distinguishes between four types of them. In broad terms, they are these. First, situations affecting public welfare and caused by an accident such as a massive chemical spill or by natural disasters such as earthquakes, floods, or tornadoes that are of such magnitude as to exceed the capacity of the affected province to respond and to require special powers for an effective federal response. Second, public order disturbances that threaten the security of Canada and which are so serious as to be national emergencies. Third, international emergencies requiring Canada to take special preparatory measures in concert with our allies. Fourth, finally, war itself. Passage of this legislation will enable the federal government to fulfill its constitutional responsibility to provide for the safety and the security of Canadians during national emergencies. The Emergencies Act will enable the government to discharge its responsibility for public order emergencies that become national emergencies without having to resort to the War Measures Act, an archaic and dangerous piece of legislation completely out of tune with democratic Canadian life. The Emergencies Act will be subject to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Canadian Bill of Rights. It will be consistent with the 1967 United Nations International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The proposed legislation includes fully safeguarded and appropriately limited exceptional powers to deal with four types of national emergency. It ensures that the exceptional powers granted by Parliament will be no more than what is needed for a specific emergency. It provides for Parliament to review and, if necessary, revoke emergency powers introduced under the Act. In addition, it contains provisions to ensure that individuals who suffer loss or injury as a result of application of the Act will be fairly compensated. It has been drafted in consultation with the provinces, and it contains appropriate recognition of provincial interests. Mr. Speaker, several provinces have written to say that they are in general agreement with the Emergencies Act. Several have written expressing their approval and the view that the new legislation will bring Canada into line with other modern states which have had similar legislation for years. The Minister responsible for Alberta Public Safety Services, who recently experienced firsthand what can happen out of the blue to a community, had some suggestions for changes to the Act, but went on to say, quote, "Nevertheless, one must feel that this is the most important legislation introduced in this activity in recent years, and your government's efforts are to be strongly commended in this regard. We also feel strongly that every effort must be made to ensure the best legislation possible, and therefore hope that you will give every consideration to the suggestions we've made." After the tabling, the Premier of Saskatchewan wrote to me, quote, "I'm encouraged by this initiative. The proposed pieces of legislation will more accurately reflect the way in which the federal and provincial governments actually carry out their roles and responsibilities in this area. I wish you a successful and speedy passage of the legislation you have tabled, and I look forward to the continued cooperation of our respective governments in the area of emergency preparedness." The previous New Brunswick Minister of Municipal Affairs said he was gratified to learn that I had tabled the Emergencies Bill and Companion Emergency Preparedness Bill. He said, quote, "The bills address a long-standing need to contemporize emergency legislation in Canada, and New Brunswick supports this new legislation without reservation." The Minister responsible for the Manitoba Emergency Measures Organization, and my friend from Brant will be particularly interested in his view, wrote, quote, "The bills are indeed timely and a significant improvement over the existing Act. In particular, the protection of civil liberties is a critical component of your proposed new statute. I welcome the continuing opportunity as provided in the Acts for consultation on matters of national emergency preparedness and response policy. You may be assured of our cooperation and support in this vital area." He went on to say that, quote, "Certainly some of the existing programs established by Emergency Preparedness Canada are tangible evidence of federal-provincial cooperation, and it is my hope that these will be enhanced by the new legislation." Mr. Speaker, if there were as close collaboration in all areas of government as there is in emergency preparedness, there would be few stresses and strains in our federal system. When I tabled Bill C-76 on June 26th, I deliberately did so before the summer recess to give members of this House and Canadians at large adequate time to review its contents and to make suggestions if there were areas where they felt that it could be improved. It's because I believe that the legislation has important implications for national security and because the civil liberties of Canadians should be considered in a period of calm that I felt that sufficient time should elapse before the bill was tabled for second reading. I also indicated that I would listen seriously to suggestions for improvements to ensure that at the end of the day, the best possible legislation would be passed. After the initial tabling, I received many letters from private citizens and politicians congratulating me on finally moving to do away with the War Measures Act. A few people, among them some federal politicians, expressed concerns. In some instances, these criticisms were reasonable and constructive. In others, the negative comment stemmed perhaps from a superficial reading and misunderstanding of the legislation. As I indicated earlier, some felt that Part 4 of the Emergencies Act is virtually identical to the War Measures Act. They say that since the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms now applies to the War Measures Act, there's really no difference at all, except that there could be a greater temptation to use the Emergencies Act because it gives an illusion of being better safeguarded than the War Measures Act and could be more easily invoked. My earlier comments demonstrated that this is simply not true, and a careful reading will confirm this. Others have said that the Macdonald Commission did not think that the government needed any additional powers for emergencies in peacetime. I can assure the members of this House that Bill C-77 incorporates virtually all of the relevant recommendations of the 1979 Macdonald Commission. From the outset, we've been concerned that these recommendations should be respected as far as possible. There's one notable exception, however. The Macdonald Commission did not recommend repealing the War Measures Act and replacing it with new emergencies legislation. Unlike members of the Macdonald Commission, we believe, as all parties in this House of Commons have stated in the past and committed themselves in the past, that the War Measures Act is so inadequate and poses such a severe threat to the fundamental rights and freedoms of Canadians that we do not wish to live with this monster any longer. Mr. Speaker, as I've said, I've read through the recommendations referring to emergencies legislation in the Macdonald Commission's report, and I note with pleasure that the vast majority of those recommendations have been incorporated in Bill C-77 in one form or another, particularly in regard to procedures for parliamentary oversight of emergency powers. Part 1 of the Emergencies Act deals with public welfare emergencies and is designed to enable the federal government to mobilize the resources of the nation in response to a public welfare emergency that's so serious as to be a national emergency. Provisions of the Act enable the federal government to organize the response to a provincial or territorial request for assistance. The Act will ensure that the burden of responding to and recovering from such a national emergency is shared by the nation as a whole. All provincial governments have enacted standing emergencies legislation to deal with public welfare emergencies. By and large, they've developed sufficient competence, resources, and experience to cope with most public welfare emergencies, either with or without the assistance of contiguous provinces or of the federal government. However, in a national emergency, the combined resources of the entire nation may have to be mobilized to deal with the emergency. A vast, coordinated, and timely response of the sort which could be required could only be provided using the federal emergency power. While provincial governments have the authority through their various emergency acts to requisition resources in the province for emergency use within the province, they do not and constitutionally cannot have the authority to requisition resources in the province for use outside the province. Only the federal government can do this. In the interest of federalism, as well as of the effective mobilization of the nation's resources, we recognize that the provinces should have a role in the process leading to the declaration of a public welfare emergency, and the Emergencies Act embodies this principle. Although the federal government would always consult with the provinces before declaring a national emergency, the recent trend toward improved federal-provincial consultation, as well as several studies of constitutional reform, all lead to the conclusion that the provinces ought to have a stronger voice and a more formal role in the process leading to the declaration of an emergency. Part 1 of the Emergencies Act therefore includes appropriate procedures requiring provincial consultation. It's the intention of the federal government to work continuously with provincial governments through Emergency Preparedness Canada to develop detailed plans and procedures to facilitate effective consultation if the need to consider invocation of the Act were to arise. The Emergencies Act stipulates in Part 1 that Part 1 may not be invoked unless the province in which the direct effects of the emergency principally occur indicates that it could not cope without federal authorities and assistance. In large emergencies affecting several provinces, all provinces affected must be consulted before a declaration can be made under the Act. In addition, the Act states that provincial jurisdiction over the police forces, including the RCMP, over which the province normally has jurisdiction will not be altered. With these safeguards, then, it will not be possible for the federal government to use the legislation to intervene unilaterally in provincial or territorial emergencies that are within the capacities or authorities of the provinces or the territories to cope with. Mr. Speaker, some people have expressed doubts about the provision of C-77 dealing with public welfare emergencies having serious implications for the right to strike. This is a point that certainly should be clarified. However, Mr. Speaker, I would remind the House that I've stated publicly on previous occasions that this Act is not intended to be used to settle a legitimate dispute between an employer and employees. I've already said that if there's uncertainty in the language of the bill in this regard, it will be dealt with in committee to ensure that the original intent is respected. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, we've seen very recently an instance where Parliament has been prepared to introduce special legislation which was well tuned to the specific exigencies of the circumstance. And that's the appropriate way to deal if the federal government believes it's necessary to intervene in the case of a strike. We will make it abundantly clear that this legislation is not intended to and could not be used to interfere in that way. Mr. Speaker, I personally have little difficulty with this point. I believe that the constraints of the definition of a national emergency in the preamble, when added to the further constraints of the definition of a public welfare emergency in Section 3, effectively ensure that this bill could never be used to terminate a strike and impose the settlement of a legitimate dispute between an employer and employees. Likewise, it's been said, probably the most contentious clause of this bill is the one that deals with public order emergencies. This is the type of situation that gave rise to the use of the War Measures Act in 1970. This clause takes its definition of threat from the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service Act. This fact alone should make us very cautious, because of the difficulties already encountered with CSIS in determining what is subversion and what is legitimate dissent. That was one view of the legislation. Mr. Speaker, I would remind members of this House that the definition of threats to the security of Canada received exhaustive scrutiny by Parliament in 1983 during deliberations on the CSIS Act. The language in this definition has therefore already received Parliament's blessing. I would also remind the House that the definitions at the head of each of the four major parts of this bill, including the definition of threats to the security of Canada, do not stand alone. They must be read in conjunction with the definition of a national emergency in the preamble of the bill and in conjunction with other restricting provisions. In other words, Mr. Speaker, before the government can declare a public order emergency under Part 2, the emergency situation must correspond to the definition of a national emergency as stated in the preamble. I'm told that this double test, as it's called, will be used by the courts to assess the government's compliance with the deliberate constraints and safeguards that have been built into the definitions of this bill. Mr. Speaker, for greater clarity, let me read again the definition of a national emergency that appears in the preamble of the bill. Since it seems to have been overlooked by some people, it bears repetition. A national emergency is defined as follows, quote, an urgent, critical situation of a temporary nature that imperils the well-being of Canada as a whole, or that is of such proportions or nature as to exceed the capacity or authority of a province to deal with it, and thus can be effectively dealt with only by Parliament in the exercise of the powers conferred on it by the Constitution. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that all members of this House will appreciate that the standard established in this definition is very stringent indeed. Before the government can declare a national emergency under this Act, the emergency in question must affect the whole of Canada, or be so great as to exceed the capacity of the provinces to cope with the emergency. When this definition is read against the definition of threats to the security of Canada in Section 14, and in conjunction with provisions that the emergency must necessitate the taking of special temporary measures for dealing with it, and that the special measures must be reasonable, it's apparent that the benign and benevolent activities, such as ministerial contacts with the African National Committee, or with the African National Congress, would never amount to a national emergency, as some have suggested, requiring invocation of the Emergencies Act. To the challenge that a public order emergency also gives Cabinet the right to prohibit public assembly, and that a Canadian could have difficulty in availing himself or herself of the right to protest peacefully the declaration of the emergency powers, I would reply that there are absolutely no restrictions on the freedom of expression, or of thought, conscience, or religion under this part of Bill C-77. Unlike the War Measures Act, Part 2 of Bill C-77 confers no new powers relating to search, seizure, arrest, or detention. The provisions of the criminal code in these areas are considered adequate to ensure law and order. Restricting public assembly would be authorized only to protect lives and property during a serious national emergency. Mr. Speaker, let me just dwell on this for a minute, because I think this is a very important point which the House should recognize. One of the grave threats to civil liberties that's contained in the War Measures Act as it stands today was shown very markedly in the regulations under the War Measures Act when it was invoked in October of 1970. We found civil liberties across the country suspended to deal with a situation which was relatively isolated in terms of its implication. Even though the FLQ problems that existed were taking place in the province of Quebec, people as far away as Vancouver, British Columbia, or Guelph in Wellington County and in my area found that their civil liberties were suspended as well. This is a much more finely tuned piece of legislation. In the province of Quebec, people found that suddenly there was a retroactive crime being created. This will not be possible under Bill C-77. Mr. Speaker, this section of the bill gives no new powers of arrest. We will not be having, under the powers in this bill in Section 2, the knock on the door in the middle of the night because of a crime being created retroactively. We will not have the situation that someone who once attended a meeting of an organization would have the burden of proof shifted onto him to prove that he is not a member of that organization. Mr. Speaker, how could any of us be expected to prove that we don't belong to an organization? It may be possible and easily possible to prove that we do belong to something, whether it's a church or a political party or any other organization. But how can you prove conclusively that you don't belong to one if attendance at a meeting is deemed to be adequate proof that you do? Mr. Speaker, that's the problem that there is today with the War Measures Act. That's how civil liberties were affected in October of 1970. And that's the sort of abuse that we're determined to correct. Mr. Speaker, it's essential that we be able to have legislation in a period of time that better protects civil liberties. Mr. Speaker, as for the notion that a legitimate protest against the emergency declaration could be suppressed and no one would find out, or that the government could censor the media or simply forbid travel to the troubled area, and that it would be difficult for anyone to find out if the declaration of emergency were justified if no one was allowed in or out of the area, I reply that there's no mention of censorship at all in this bill, in this section at all, and that in fact censorship would be possible only during a war emergency in Part 4. Restrictions on travel would be limited to the area of the emergency, and only reasonable restrictions on travel would be permitted. That is, restrictions that would prevent further loss of life by creating an evacuation zone, for instance. Some have concerns about the clause dealing with international emergencies. They suggest that the definition of an international emergency is extremely broad, and that the bill speaks of a threat to any country in which the political, economic, or security interests of Canada or any of its allies are involved. As in the case of the definitions in each of the other parts, this definition should be looked at within the context of the definition of a national emergency as stated in the preamble. There's no way that an incident such as an attack on the Start, for example, would amount to a national emergency in Canada. Mr. Speaker, could I suggest that members of this House read carefully through both the definition of a national emergency in the preamble and to read it opposite the definition of an international emergency in Section 25. It's clear that an international emergency must first be so serious as to constitute a national emergency in Canada before the government can declare the emergency. Mr. Speaker, in my view, only a global crisis of major proportions could ever meet the high double test which was established here. I will welcome the opportunity to deal with this issue in committee, and if wording can be found that will clarify definition of international emergency without destroying our ability to act in appropriate cases, I will certainly consider incorporating it in the bill. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to address any concerns about the provisions of the bill authorizing extraordinary powers of search and seizure during an international emergency. I must agree that in light of representations I've had from civil liberties groups since the tabling of this legislation at the beginning of last summer, I will be prepared to look carefully at the wording of this power and the possibility of clarifying its intent. I should explain that its purpose is, for example, to enforce and monitor defense contracts, to prevent hoarding and overcharging in scarce commodities, and to prevent black marketing in an international emergency. However, we shall certainly be looking very closely at this section, and I'll welcome input from members of Parliament with regard to it. Mr. Speaker, some criticism has been levelled at Part 4 of Bill C-77, saying that it is difficult to see any difference between this part and the current War Measures Act. Let me remind the House that there are indeed great differences, and permit me to summarise what I said earlier on this point in French. The Emergencies Act, Part 4, is applicable to war or other armed conflict, real or imminent, whereas the War Measures Act is applicable to war, invasion, or insurrection, real or apprehended. Invocation of the Emergencies Act must be justified and can be contested, whereas a declaration of the War Measures Act is conclusive evidence of the existence of an emergency which cuts off all recourse to the courts. Orders and regulations made under the Emergencies Act are subject to parliamentary review, whereas under the War Measures Act there is no such provision. Under the Emergencies Act, Parliament can initiate a motion to revoke a declaration. Under the War Measures Act, there is no such provision. The Canadian Bill of Rights applies to the Emergencies Act. It does not apply to the War Measures Act. The Emergencies Act cannot be in effect for more than 360 days, and any extension requires parliamentary approval. There's no time limit at all under the War Measures Act. Mr. Speaker, as a past joint chairman of the Standing Joint Committee on Regulations and Other Statutory Instruments, I've joined with others in this House and in the Senate in pressing to have governments include parliamentary scrutiny and control over delegated legislation. This bill gives Parliament a virtually unprecedented degree of control over the use of the powers contained in it. One can only wish that there had been such parliamentary power when the War Measures Act was invoked in October of 1970. Mr. Speaker, we've bent over backwards in drafting this legislation to ensure the preservation of civil rights and liberties. By limiting the Emergencies Bill to 4 carefully circumscribed categories of national emergency, Canadians will have assurances that the Act will not be used in a frivolous manner to deal with localized or relatively minor emergencies. The Emergencies Act will enable the Government of Canada to respond to major international crisis by gradually adopting appropriate preventive and preparatory measures in concert with their allies without having to take the provocative step of invoking the War Measures Act. It will eliminate the need to deal with national emergencies by hurriedly introducing excessive or flawed ad hoc legislation during the heated and confused situation that usually develops after a major emergency has occurred. And it will help to stimulate, in cooperation and consultation with the provinces, an enhanced national standard of emergency preparedness. Passage of this bill will ensure an appropriate response to emergencies while assuring that the fundamental rights of Canadians are fully protected in emergencies. If this Act had been in place in World War II, Canadian citizens could not have been so cavalierly interned and their property confiscated. Likewise, in 1970, Part 2 of this legislation would have been used instead of the War Measures Act, and the abuses we saw under that Act would not have been possible. Quebecers would not have been arbitrarily arrested and detained simply because they were associated with a particular group. Mr. Speaker, I think it's important to re-emphasize that, unlike the War Measures Act, Part 2 of Bill C-77 confers no new powers relating to search, seizure, arrest, or detention. The provisions of the criminal code in these areas are considered to be entirely adequate to deal with the instigators of public disorder, even under unusual and exceptional circumstances. As I've said before, Mr. Speaker, the need for this kind of legislation has been long recognized by all parties in Parliament. It's important that we have the mechanisms in place to deal with national disasters, but it's equally important that we're able to respond effectively to the more day-to-day occurrences. By putting in place adequate emergencies legislation, the federal government will not only be in better position to respond to the needs of Canadians in an increasingly complex environment, but Canada will be brought into line with other modern democratic states which have had comparable legislation for years. This legislative package, consisting of C-77 and C-76, fulfills the government's election commitments in the field of emergency preparedness, and does so with proper regard for the civil rights of individuals and for the federal nature of Canada. Paraphrase the Honourable Member for Saint-Denis, speaking in the House last April. If members have suggestions to make, I'd be delighted to hear them, because we could have a legislation which is better, more in line with the spirit of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and more compatible with what we want to defend. Mr. Speaker, revision of the emergencies legislation was part of the government's election platform in 1984. In February 1985, at a press conference, the Prime Minister publicly committed the government to an early review of the War Measures Act, when in answer to a journalist's question about when his government was going to do away with the Act, he said, "I don't think you'll be able to ask me this question much longer. It's under review and we hope to have something for you in an early moment. We hope to bring something forward that will be more appropriate than what we've had in the past." Mr. Speaker, we've kept our promise. I hope that we can move quickly through second reading of Bill C-77 with a view towards starting detailed review in a legislative committee as soon as possible. Consideration of this legislation provides Parliament with its first opportunity for a full review and debate of emergency preparedness matters, and it also provides an opportunity for the general public to become informed of and engaged in the issues involved. Finally, passage of this bill will provide effective machinery to deal with unforeseen and potentially disastrous events while fully safeguarding the rights of Canadians. Mr. Speaker, I'm fully in accord with my friend the Honourable Member for Brant, who said in the House we should deliberate in an air of calm and reason. We have time to consider what we're setting in place for future generations. There is no war. There is no apprehended insurrection, no violence, no upheaval. Now is the time to give it straightforward, serious, cautious, and deliberate consideration. Mr. Speaker, I'm heartened that my honourable friend should say this, and I agree with him entirely that, in his words, quote, "now is the time for the parliamentary process to shine." I also totally agree that we'll need testimony from both expert witnesses and from ordinary Canadians to get this legislation right, for I know full well that it's an issue that touches the very lives and liberties of every Canadian. I urge the House to send the bill to committee with the least possible delay, so that the committee can get on with its work of inviting the public to be heard. I'm confident that all members of the House recognize the importance of this legislation, and I believe that together we can work out in a non-partisan way the best legislation possible.